Okay, in order to get you playing something straight away, we're going to have a look at your first chord. But before we do that, we do need to show you a couple of things first of all. We need to talk about the strings and the frets, these metal bars along here. Now the strings are named, or numbered I should say, from the thinnest one, number 1, right the way through to the thickest one, number 6. And I know this seems like it's in the reverse order. A lot of people think that this one, the thickest one, should be string number 1, but it's not. So we do have to remember that the thinnest string is the first string. Also, these frets are going to be very important to us. The frets are what will help us play different notes on the guitar. The word fret itself, when we're playing the guitar, can have two different meanings. They're quite similar, but they are a little bit different. So the metal bar itself is the fret, but also this entire space behind the metal bar is also the fret as well. Don't worry, I will explain or elaborate on it if I think that the meaning is not clear, but usually it's clear in the context. So if I ask you to put your finger in the fret, we're talking about in the space, and if I'm talking to you about moving your finger close to the fret or beside the fret, well then we're talking about the metal bar, so being close to or beside the metal bar. Now after all that, we're going to have a look at playing your first chord. And what I want you to do for me is to take your first finger and I want you to put it in the second fret, so in this space here, on the 5th string. So the tip of your finger going onto that 5th string in the 2nd fret. And then I'd like you to take your second finger and place that directly underneath on the 4th string in the 2nd fret. And to get that finger as close to the metal bar, to that 2nd fret, as close to it as possible. Okay, so your fingers should look something like the way I have mine placed here. So the first finger is kind of halfway in that space, and the second finger is nice and close to that metal bar. Now, once you've done that, we're going to take a closer look at what's going on with your left hand to make sure that everything is correct. There are a few things that we need to make sure are correct. So we need to make sure that these knuckles here are bent, that you're using the tips of your fingers. And your general hand position here, we want to try and have this part here, your forearm, your wrist, being as straight as you can. Now, we don't have to be taking measurements or anything, but we just like to keep it as straight as possible. What we're trying to avoid is this kind of thing here, where you're pushing your wrist out too far, and the opposite is where you're bringing your wrist in too far. So in both of those extreme cases, your wrist will be very bent, and that will put your muscles under undue strain. So we want to avoid that. We want to try and make everything as easy as possible. So if your forearm going into your wrist, into your hand here, is nice and straight, reasonably straight we should say, well then the muscles should work quite well and you won't have any problems. Your thumb. A lot of people ask me about what's the best position for the thumb. Everybody's hands are different. Some have larger hands, some smaller hands, so it's going to vary quite a bit. Usually if your thumb is kind of directly behind your first finger, that should be okay. Might stick up a little bit, but again, once all the other conditions are in place, well then wherever your thumb ends up should be the right place. So we want the tips of your fingers. First knuckle joint to be bent, making sure that the fingers are going on perpendicular to the neck. You don't want the palm of your hand touching the neck at all, and to try and keep this first finger away from the neck of the guitar as well. So just to recap on all that, tips of your fingers, first knuckle joint to be bent, so you don't want this. Okay. First knuckle joint has to be bent so that you're using the tips of the fingers. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail, I'll show you why. And then we don't want this touching the guitar, we don't want this idea. And we don't want the first finger touching the neck either. Now it only has to clear the neck by a millimeter, a very small amount. Once all those things are in place, your thumb should be in the correct position then. And also your wrist here. So trying to keep that reasonably straight. Okay. Now, that's our chord. So once you have your fingers in position, you can squeeze in a little bit and we're going to try strumming the strings then. So get your plectrum in between your finger and your thumb and we're going to strum. Now, once you have a nice clear sound like that, we're going to check and make sure that everything is in place. So we're going to play each string individually. So that's all good. Now I'm going to demonstrate to you some of those things that I asked you not to do, just so you know what to look out for and what to listen for as well when you're practicing. So if you don't bend the knuckles on there like so, the chances are that your finger will touch off the next string, so you'll hear something like this. Okay, that's not what we want obviously. So keep those knuckles bent. If this first finger is touching the neck, there's a good chance that you'll hear this. Again, obviously, you don't want to hear that. Other sounds that you might hear, kind of rattles and buzzes, so that kind of sound, that can really relate to two things. Either you're not putting enough pressure on the string, or you're too far away from the metal bar, the fret. Now, that's going to vary depending on the chord. So in this chord, for example, this finger, first finger, cannot get any closer to the metal bar. So we just have to make sure there's enough pressure on there. Okay. The next finger, the second finger, that should be nice and close to the fret. Now if it's not, if we move it back a little bit, it's going to be a little bit rattly, buzzy. So if I move it closer to the fret, nice clear sound coming through there. So again, make sure you check through all of these things. This early stage is going to be very important, so first few days, first week or two, really check, double check all of your chords, check each note individually, make sure everything is coming out nice and clear, so that your hand will learn where it has to go. Okay, so that's your first chord. That's called E minor. Now we're going to go on and have a look at some more chords, but in the next lesson I'm going to show you how to read the chord diagrams, and these diagrams will also appear on the screen during the lesson, so you'll be able to see where your fingers have to go, as well as me showing you where your fingers have to go. And these chord diagrams are kind of universal, they're used everywhere. You'll see them on websites and you'll see them in books if you buy books as well. So moving on to the next lesson, I'll show you how to read those chord diagrams.